So I'm Chris Houghton. I'm head of FMCG at Cambridge Design Partnership. Delighted to welcome Ivy Ross from Google.
Hi, I'm
Ivy. Ivy.
Good morning. Great to be here.
It'd be great for you to introduce yourself and your role to the audience at GIF.
Yeah, so I'm currently Vice President of Design for the Hardware and Service Division of Google.
And another introduction, we've got Sally drawing live from Live Illustration, so she'll be capturing some of the things we cover during our discussion. Google have evolved over the years, starting as a software company, moving into hardware. Describe the journey you've been on bringing that design vision to life.
Yeah, you know, I've done a lot in my career, and but this job has been an incredible culmination of a lot of things. Being a software company, really deciding to jump into hardware, it was a big transition to, you know, with software, it's very much a quicker cycle of iteration and development. And, you know, hardware is hard, and it's a whole different timetable. So it's really been like a startup within Google, which has been great in terms of we've had to create our own culture that supports, you know, hardware and all of the operational gates. But from a design perspective, it was quite a task to figure out what are the design principles that would inform making these three-dimensional forms, because, you know, Google had become a verb, and, you know, what are the design principles of objects with a brand Google? So the team and I, along with marketing and some other partners, we dug through all of the past Google materials and watched hours of videos to find what's the root at the essence. What's the essence of Google that we could then translate appropriately into three-dimensional form? And so the words we came out with were human, optimistic, and bold. And then we took those words and together created a bunch of adjectives of how we would put that into action. So, for example, you know, human for us was making sure that the forms we created felt a little more natural, a little more engaging than one slick surface that a lot of technology was becoming. Optimistic was, for us, a little bit of making sure there was a little bit of surprise and delight in each piece. So, for example, you know, having something in a neutral gray color, turning it over, and there's a surprise pop of orange, let's say. And bold was, you know, there to make sure that we're not afraid to step out and do new things, like cover a VR headset in fabric. So those were our guiding principles, and it was really fun to take a company that was so established, go on an archaeological dig to find out what those words should be to inform the design aesthetic.
Many of the companies represented at GIF are probably in the opposite situation, where they're a physical product company. What do you think the secret is to seamlessly integrating the physical with the digital?
Yeah, well, you know, I think nowadays the product isn't just the thing, it is the entire experience. So, and my team is engaged in some of the user experience for some of the products, not all of them, but it's really key that we dance together back and forth, because you have to keep coming at it. Like, I feel like you have to keep zooming out and coming at it from the customer perspective, and thinking about the interaction model with throughout the form. So everything from, you know, the physical buttons to the interaction on screens to the lighting systems that you might design. So it really is, and I think schools need to almost, you know, there's industrial design and then there's user experience, but I think in the future there needs to be more classes around the holistic nature of the experience. So it's been fun to kind of pioneer how that might show up.
Our talk today is the intersection of design and science. What do you feel the relationship is between the two at Google?
Well, I mean, at Google, I think it really is about data and intuition. I know, I believe that intuition actually draws on more data because, you know, our unconscious, when we take in so much information every moment, and as I understand it, only 5% kind of goes to the frontal lobe and the other 95% is in our unconscious. So when we get a hunch or an idea or an intuitive hit, it's actually coming from this incredible database with that idea. So I think it needs to be a marriage of both, a balance between data and intuition. And so that's what my team and I go back and forth and use. So, but you know, there's also a whole new field. Like I now have material scientists in my group, and I really think this future of, you know, biodesign, where designers are, you know, going to be designing for regenerative futures, you know, to help us identify the root causes of design problems, and providing, you know, technologies to act on them to create a world without waste. And it's going to take scientists and designers to work together. I mean, I've been reading and seeing these new things like coatings that activate in low intensity light to kill bacteria that you could put on fabric. And so I'm very excited about this field of, and you know, for me, scientists and designers is really like art and design, art and science working together. And I think that's the only way we're going to solve some of the future and existing problems we have today as humans.
And I know you're a big proponent of neuroaesthetics, and that in itself is bringing together the science and the design. For those less familiar, could you describe that field of research for us?
Yeah, so I've been an advisor to the Arts and Mind Lab at Johns Hopkins, which is studying neuroscience. It's interesting, when I first got the call to be an advisor, and they said, well, we're now proving through neuroscience that aesthetics actually affect your biology and your well-being. And of course, as a designer, artist, creator, I was like, well, of course it does. And then I realized, wait a minute, I know that. Those of us who are in the field know that. But it's amazing the fact that now neuroscience can prove that to the world so that people accept it. So it really is, so we did an exhibition in Milan at the design fair where we had, because I really wanted to put this into action, really to show people that everything that we take in, whether it's, you know, the forms we hold, the colors of the space we walk into, the geometry of the architecture of what we walk into, affects our biology. You know, there is what we think, and then there's what we feel. And I think we need to bring those two things together more, or be aware of them. And so this exhibition was 3 different rooms. They were all living room, dining rooms, because we had to hold the control to be the same. 5 people at a time walked through and spent 5 minutes in each room, no phones, no talking. We had a band that they wore that had sensors that picked up on different things like temperature, heartbeat, etc. And each room was designed through this neuroaesthetic understanding, using, you know, sound, color, scent, texture, shape, to be very different environments. And what was great is in between each room, there was a palette cleanser of just a foam room that you walked through. And at the end of it, the band was taken off. The data was downloaded. We showed that we deleted your personal data. But what the output was this beautiful, almost ink blot circle that showed each participant how their physiology was reacting in each room, And what we were searching for is what was the room where your body was most at ease, least stressed, most at ease. And what I was hoping came true, in that it would have been uninteresting if the room a person thought the one they liked better was the same as their body felt the most at home in. And half the people, there was a disconnect, meaning their cognitive mind, they'd walk in and go, oh, I love this room, to themselves. But their body wasn't feeling as comfortable in it as a different room. So it was a great exercise or experience for people to actually be shown, reflected back, what their body was feeling in each of these spaces. And, you know, a lot of press asked me afterwards, oh, are you going to do a band for Google that tells you how you're feeling all the time? And I'm like, oh my God, I do not want to live in a world where we need that. I said, this was really done just to bring awareness to the fact that we are feeling all the time, and that we have control of how we feel in some ways by the environments we create. So it was really more to bring a consciousness to that idea.
Well, I'm glad I wasn't wearing a wristband at the start of the recording here, because I'm sure it would have gone off the charts. I'm longing for a couch and a microphone. So it's interesting with consumers. You were saying about the parts of the brain. I'm sure their reaction is they have a feeling about something before they think about it. We've discussed previously about design feeling as a build on design thinking. Is that something you could expand on?
Yeah, you know, through neuroscience, I learned that actually the feeling occurs first in the body, and then you have an emotion attached to it. And so, you know, I love design thinking. I think design thinking was a great foundation for us to really understand that we need to observe consumers and find the gap, you know, what is it we're solving for? But I think, especially now, we're craving a more sensorial world, and that really also, you know, 80% of buying decisions I've read are made through emotion. There's an emotional thing that happens first when you look at an object. Now, of course, the specs, you know, then kind of comes in checking the specs, but that the feeling sensation of, oh my God, that's beautiful, or oh, I want that, is really how 80% of the decisions are made. So we're looking, again, as I said, art and science, we're now looking at both. So when the designers start a design, they talk about what's the feeling they hope to evoke from that design, or the attributes. And then when we do research, you know, we not only get feedback on some of the practical functions of the product, but also create these word clouds out of what the participants have used to describe the product, the way it looks. And then it's really been fun to see how that does or does not match the design intent. So I just think it's a, you know, another layer that's important to add onto things as we design them.
Sustainability obviously comes to mind when we're thinking about design and science, and, you know, the broader implications of climate change and those sorts of things. But I guess a consumer's perception towards something can be very different to the actual realities of whether it's higher impact or lower impact. What are Google working on in terms of sustainability and material choices?
Yeah, you know, a few years ago, it hit us all that, wait a minute, you know, design is about solving problems, and sustainability is one of the biggest problems of the century. And it really starts with us at the beginning of the food chain, so to speak, in terms of what materials we spec, what materials we design with. And so we have set goals for ourselves every year, and we're exceeding them. But for example, with the fabric for all of our speakers, we started using recycled consumer plastic PET bottles to create the yarn, so to speak. And so, you know, one bottle can make 2 speakers. And so really starting to look at least for now, how do we reuse waste? I mean, I want to get to a point in this, which I think this whole field of biodesign is coming, where we're actually going to create materials that are not waste, or we could put them back in the ground. But for now, how can we continue to reuse materials? So we also launched a phone with recycled aluminum. We've done a lot of research with consumers, and I think they want to do the right thing, but we have to educate them also along the way. So we're very devoted to using as much, and even in our packaging, we're using less plastic. And, we're really, I mean, it's not easy, but as I said, we're built as designers for solving problems. So this is just like we solve problems for the consumer. This is about solving problems for Mother Earth.
We've got some interesting talks later in GIF around the circular economy and sustainability. So we're looking forward to those. A lot of these design instincts that you've mentioned are really shaped during our childhood and upbringing and education. I understand your father was an industrial designer with Raymond Loewy. Could you describe the influence he had shaping how you think and your creativity?
Yeah, so my dad worked for the famous Raymond Loewy. He did the Marlboro cigarette package. He was one of those classic, I think he redesigned the Coca-Cola bottle. And my dad worked on the Studebaker Hawk, the car that looks like it's going forwards and backwards, as well as a number of products, and then had his own firm afterwards. But being the firstborn and being a woman, he would tote this little girl around and point out to me, Ivy, look at how this light fixture is connected. What else can you learn from those connections? And how do you apply that to a different object? Or he would take me to car shows, and I'd be eye level with the hubcap. And so he'd teach me almost how to go into that flow, what I now call flow state, and observe the mechanics of how something is made and the wonder of how things are put together. And so it was an unusual childhood because it was constant conversation, looking at materials and objects. And I would crawl into his room and his office playing with different materials. And so I was very inspired by the way he saw the world, which was basically looking at things and getting information from them and seeing them for beyond what they appear to be, and how to extrapolate information and apply it. So I think I couldn't help myself but be creative. And when my first instinct, I ended up being a metalsmith, ironically, a jewelry designer. I think in part it was because being exposed to those hubcaps and really understanding how metal, different ways to attach metal, it was the thing that came easiest to me. But that evolved from, for me, it wasn't the journey. I never wanted to repeat doing the same thing. So it went from jewelry design, which I was really glad to have made things with my hands, because I think there's something about when you have an idea and you have to manifest it, making it yourself, it creates new neural pathways. But after that, on to designing all kinds of accessories, consumer goods, toys, because for me it became quickly how, not just how an individual has an idea, but once I got into the corporate world, how a team works together to kind of co-create a vision. But he was really, I admired him. I wanted to be like him. And it was an interesting dynamic between father and daughter, because I think I shared a story with you. And I only share this as inspiration for folks, because especially women, I remember at college, I told him I wanted to go to design school and be like him. And he said to me, "Oh, Ivy, marry someone rich, be a school teacher, have your summers off." And I remember feeling in my body like someone literally had just lifted my dreams out of my body. But I got very clear, it's like no one is going to rob me of my dreams. And in telling myself this, and I said, "Okay, Dad." And it's the day my mom says I went to competition with him, which was really, you know, I realized years later it was out of love, pure love, that he said that, because, you know, in the 50s and 60s, it was not easy being a designer, because you know, people wouldn't spend money on redesigning something unless it was absolutely necessary. And so he really didn't want me to have a hard life. He was protecting his little girl. But for me, I'm actually quite thankful that he did that, because I think it created a drive in me that really, in some ways, overamped and said, you know, always in the back of my mind was, no one can rob me of my dreams. And so I went full steam ahead and pursued them, and have been very grateful for the career that I've had.
I'm sure we can probably all look back to some point in our lives that just set a fire under us and set us in a certain direction. I know the late Sir Ken Robinson's book, Finding Your Element, is about people discovering their creativity. And I understand you met Ken a few times.
Oh yeah, back in New York, when I lived in New York, I think in the 80s, I was fortunate to be at a few dinner parties, salons of people that were creative at the time in New York. And I was so moved by his stories around, you know, his classic one around going to classrooms and starting in kindergarten and saying, "Who's an artist?" And all the hands would go up, going to first grade, and maybe 3/4 of the hands would be up. In second grade, it was half. And by the time he got to third grade, maybe 10% of the class's hands were up. And so we would have lengthy conversations around kind of, what are we doing wrong in education that we're sucking creativity out of kids? And, you know, I kind of became known a bit as an innovation expert in the corporations I worked in. And I said, well, this is exactly the problem, why when we get grown up and this has been sucked out of us, it's very hard to get it back, versus we have to create an environment where those things are honored and accepted. And it really, you know, really comes down to as he and I would talk, the criticism, you know, by others of, no, that's not the way you draw something. And I think when we come in as kids, we're pure spirit or soul, and we know who we are. We are very whole and intact. And then all these things get imposed, the should, the could, and it just, you know, can suck the soul out of you. And so I loved the kind of the message that he was really going around, and the important message that he was delivering. And yeah, so sorry to see him recently transition, but he was super important during those days to bring that message. There's one story that I don't know if it's in any of his books that I just want to share, because it was so moving to me, where he said he had also, you know, he would watch and observe in classrooms. And in one classroom, I think it was a third grade class, the teacher said, draw someone and don't tell me who it is, or just have someone in mind and draw it. And then she'd walk around and look over the shoulder of the kids and talk to them about what they were drawing. And one little girl, the teacher came over and said, you know, who are you drawing? And the little girl said, God. And the teacher said, you can't do that. We don't know what he looks like. And she said, you will when I'm done drawing him.
It's a fantastic line, but also a heartbreaking reality, that the idea that you get educated out of creativity. GIF will be paying tribute to Sir Ken Robinson on Thursday around lunchtime, and that ties in nicely with the Team Tech team that will be joining us again. With this year's GIF conference is about bringing back the fun, and we've touched on a lot of serious topics throughout the day. But I'd be interested to know how you encourage your team to have fun whilst they're innovating.
Well, I think, first I want to say I sat on the International Board of Play, because I think this idea of play is so important. And it's what we did best as a child when we imagined. I mean, imagination is so important. And in fact, the opposite of play is not work. It's, depression. And when we played as kids, part of it is to, take a cardboard box, and it could be a TV set, it could be a tent. We learn what possibilities there are. And so I think, as we get older and into companies especially, we're so driven toward productivity that we don't play enough. So, so what happens, and the definition of play is really doing something different than you do day in and day out that doesn't have an outcome, a prescribed outcome. And that is super important, because we're so driven toward, like I said, productivity and what's the output of this time I'm putting in. And so for me, play is being able to just play with ideas without necessarily an end goal. And so we definitely, like, I've brought a sculptress into Google to work with the team to play with clay. And it was so great. Again, no outcome. There was no agenda, just like to give them something different than they do day in and day out, and with no expectations. And it was so great to see. I think it was a week later, one of the young designers sent me, it's like, oh my God, I was so, after playing with my hands with clay, they were working on, I think it was the next Comcast device. They were like, instead of going right to CAD on computer, I first worked with wood and carved a form and then put it into CAD. And so this idea, I think it's in part my job as what I call the orchestra conductor of the team right now, to try and find ways to give the team time to play with new ideas and possibilities. And I even have a small group called Seed Studio, where there are just 4 or 5 people devoted to rehearsing for the future that we don't yet know is coming. So I think it's super important. I think it's why, especially American companies, for a while there, had gotten very, a lack of innovation, because I think we weren't playing enough, because we thought play was the opposite of work. And it's not. I mean, when you're playing, especially as a designer, you're actually working very hard.
And just to wrap up, because we've overspilled time a tad here. I understand your response to remote working, and lockdown. You set your designers a very playful brief.
Yes. So it was. I think when lockdown was just announced, it was my first all hands, and I thought, you know what? We're in unknown territory, and we need something to ground us. And we're the creatives of Google, or some of them for sure. And we have got to start imagining this future that I was talking about that we don't yet know. And so I invited the entire team, which there was over 100, to create a fairy tale. And I said a fairy because a fairy tale begins with once upon a time. It always has a happy ending, and there's always a lesson in between. And other than that, the rest is all fantasy and design. And so I invited the team to either by themselves or find other teammates to create these stories, so that because I believe if we don't start imaging and creating the story that we want to see come out of this trying time, we will look back and say, we didn't learn anything from here, and that this was a waste. And I don't want all these folks to have died in vain. I would love to see something good come out of this. So I think it was 50 stories. A small team and I like read everything, edited it into this book called Fairy Tales from the Future that we just printed about 100 of them to give to the senior executives at Google as some bedtime reading to really see what was in the collective minds of the creative people during this time. And it was really fun. And now, I look back and people were going, that was so good that we just had this creative project to put our mind to. And yeah, so that was a creative project that was different than what we do every day, certainly different than hardware.
Absolutely. No, it was an incredible, intuitive move. And Max is going to play one of those stories from the book. I'd like to thank you, Ivy, for your time, and from everyone on behalf of GIF. And just a quick check-in there with Sally on the illustration. Oh, she's made a beautiful job of that. So thank you, Sally, and thank you, Ivy.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me, and enjoy this wonderful story that Tarek and some of his teammates wrote and illustrated. Take care.
Thank you.